This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. On a summer day in the year 1524, Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano was sailing along the east coast of North America, a region we know today as New England, when he made note of an island near the mouth of a vast natural harbor that would later be named Narragansett Bay. This island, one of many in the area, stood out to the explorer, possibly because it reminded him of his days sailing the Mediterranean Sea, because he compared it to the island of Rhodes, off the coast of Greece, that famous and fabled port once protected by a colossal statue that became a wonder of the ancient world. Based on Verrazzano's account of his 1524 voyage, future explorers, and then settlers, referred to this place at the mouth of the bay as Rhode Island. Roger Williams was a Puritan minister living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s. But he ran afoul of the strict religious practices enacted by the colony's leaders. Although they were beliefs he shared, he was quick to remind them that they fled England to avoid religious persecution, and that, to that end, they shouldn't now be the ones to do the persecuting should anyone in the colony disagree with them. He was subsequently banished, but he wouldn't have to go far. Just southwest of Boston, approaching the coast, was a vast tract of unspoiled wilderness surrounding a protected natural harbor. Williams, who was also an outspoken lobbyist for fair dealings with the Native American tribes of the area, made a deal with the Narragansett Indian chief to purchase land and settle on a piece of that land at the top of Narragansett Bay that he christened Providence. Williams, now living as a refugee, made it known that all were welcome in Providence, regardless of their religious views. Within a few years, a handful of other religious dissenters joined the party and acquired the island near the mouth of the bay. Although the island itself was known as Rhode Island, the settlement was first Pocasset before being renamed Portsmouth in 1639. There were some disagreements as to how to best govern Portsmouth, and soon there was a breakaway settlement on the south end of the island that was named Newport. Not long after, in 1649, the settlements of Providence, Portsmouth, and Newport agreed to officially unite as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Interestingly, it was the only colony of the original 13 to insist on a government completely free of religion. Rhode Island was also the first colony to call for a Continental Congress, as well as the first to declare their independence from Britain. They were, however, the last of the original 13 to ratify the Constitution. Why? They felt the document didn't go far enough in guaranteeing personal freedoms and would only ratify once they were assured that a Bill of Rights would be added. So, thank you, Rhode Island. At just over 1,200 square miles, Rhode Island is the smallest state in the Union by land area and the 45th most populous. But with roughly 1,000 people per square mile, it ranks second in population density behind New Jersey. My guess is that it would also rank fairly high on the list of states with the most allegedly haunted places. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to the Ocean State Hauntings. What initially drew me to the content for this episode was the town of Cumberland in northeast Rhode Island. Connecting State Route 114 in the east of Cumberland with Wrentham Road far to the west approaching the town of Woonsocket is the famous Tower Hill Road. Tower Hill Road is a 2-lane meandering stretch of asphalt running east-west and cutting through an area of dense forest that includes the Catamint Brook Preserve and Ash Swamp. But really, it's just woods for miles in all directions. And it's supposedly the most haunted road in New England. Now, just to plant a flag here, I grew up in New Jersey, just a few minutes away from the most haunted road in America, Clinton Road. If you listen to season 1 of the podcast, you know all about Clinton Road. So, I'm not trying to make it a competition, but it's totally a competition. So, starting with the history of the area that surrounds Tower Hill Road. First, there are at least 2 old cemeteries in those woods that date back to colonial times when hostilities between colonists and Native Americans could erupt without warning. The forest just north of Tower Hill Road, heading towards the Massachusetts line, supposedly holds the graves of hundreds of colonists who perished in those hostilities, along with hundreds more unmarked graves of Narragansett warriors. But the ghosts along Tower Hill Road aren't Englishmen with short pants and buckles on their hats, nor are they reported to be restless spirits of brave Narragansett returned to their land. The most common sighting is of a young child on a tricycle. The story goes that sometime in the early 1930s, just a few years into the Great Depression, a 5-year-old boy whose parents were busy trying to find work and couldn't afford childcare, so the boy was left to his own devices and decided to borrow his sister's tricycle. He wasn't strong enough to pedal around in the yard or along his gravel driveway, so, unaccompanied, he pushed the tricycle out to the smooth pavement of Tower Hill Road and was struck and killed by a passing car. Over the past almost 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of a phantom child on a tricycle making his way along the road, trying to get home. There have also been reports of motorists seeing zombies lurking in the deep forests off Tower Hill. I mean, okay, like World War Z, Walking Dead, The Last of Us type undead? If they bite you, do you become one? That also sounds kind of like the vampires that are supposedly roaming some areas of New England. I find it very interesting that so many of these monster myths include that terrifying additional layer of holy shit, you're not only dealing with a zombie or a vampire or a werewolf, if they happen to bite you, you become one of them. Jeez. But by far the most interesting story that deals with Tower Hill Road concerns an old farm at the eastern end, where it meets Diamond Hill Road, so named for the massive outcropping of quartz that has become something of a tourist attraction in Cumberland. The story goes that way back in post-Civil War Rhode Island, during the Ulysses Grant administration, there was a farmer who worked the land and lived with his wife and 2 young daughters. For unknown reasons, a trio of local boys, obviously bored and not well looked after, decided that this farmer would make a good target for harassment and ridicule. At first, these boys would bully the farmer's daughters and scare them out in the woods. The antics escalated to late-night raids that involved opening the barn doors and allowing animals to escape, destroying crops, and stealing chickens. But still, that wasn't enough for these foolhardy kids. With winter approaching, they felt that it would be funny to burn the farmer's woodpile, making it difficult to heat his home when the cold weather arrived. But this prank had deadly consequences. The fire quickly exploded out of control and spread to the main house. Panicked, the boys fled without warning the family inside. The farmer was in a far-off field, repairing damage from an earlier raid perpetrated by these same hooligans, and came running when he saw the smoke and heard the screams of his family. He wasn't able to save them, and was himself burned beyond recognition in his many attempts to enter the house. The boys were brought to trial and testified that, yes, they had started the fire, but it was an accident. Now, it was a difficult time back then, with most communities dependent on farming for survival. The court acknowledged that each of the underage defendants were integral workers on their respective family farms, and while their crime inflicted unimaginable damage to one family, they couldn't, in good conscience, force 3 more families to be destroyed. The boys were released, and the matter was dropped. As the boys were let out of the court, the farmer, still almost completely covered in oozing bandages, declared to the assembled crowd that he would seek his own brand of justice when it came to punishing the 3 murderers. With his family buried in one of his own fields and his house burned to ash, the farmer disappeared. But over the next 18 months, each of the boys responsible for his crippling grief would be found. Not just dead, but mutilated. Their throats slashed and their bodies cut to shreds. It was as if an animal had attacked them. It was not long after the last body was discovered that a local farmer discovered a disfigured man secretly living in the root cellar of his barn. The authorities were contacted, and it was discovered that this disfigured squatter was indeed the farmer. His burns healed into grotesque scars, and most importantly for law enforcement, his fingernails had been grown out to a terrifying length and sharpened. This man had used no weapons to murder those boys, only his own hands and the natural weapons that he had honed for the job. The deranged farmer was hanged on the spot and his body interred beside his wife and children. The story of the farmer became local legend when he was given the nickname Freddy Fingernails. A century later, this story would be adapted into the classic horror film, A Nightmare on Elm Street. But that isn't the only horror franchise to get its inspiration from Rhode Island. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Kids, work, marriage, exercise, that new series on Netflix, maybe lunch with an old friend. What would you do if you could have an extra hour in your day? Now, I admit to having wasted some precious time in my life, wishing that I had more time. But time for what? See, that's the question. If you could manage to squeeze in that important activity, what would it actually be? Knowing what's important to you is one of the keys to happiness, and a good therapist can help you find what matters to you. Why? So you could do more of it. It's 3 years now I've been telling you guys how I've benefited from therapy since I was in my late teens. That's 30 years on and off. It's where I learned how to be a grown-up. Seriously. How to communicate, how to set boundaries, how to stop procrastinating, how to take the right chances in life. With every session, my toolbox expands. If you're thinking of giving therapy a shot, consider BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient for you. You just fill out a questionnaire and you're matched with a licensed therapist. And if you ever want to change therapists, no problem and no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/devilwithin today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/devilwithin. Due west of Cumberland, on the other side of the state, lies the small village of Harrisville. It was in this area in the early 1800s that a woman named Bathsheba Thayer was born. Bathsheba had, it would seem, an unremarkable childhood and would marry at the relatively late age of 34 to a farmer named Judson Sherman. The Shermans lived on a farm next to a property owned by the Arnold family. The Arnold house was built in 1736, 40 years before the Revolutionary War. The Arnolds and the Shermans were good neighbors, helping each other out when necessary. Bathsheba would soon give birth to a son and possibly 3 more children who died in infancy, but the records from back then are pretty spotty. Oh, and Bathsheba was also rumored to be a Satanist and a witch. One day, it's rumored, Bathsheba had agreed to watch the Arnolds' infant son while they were busy with their harvest. The baby would die while in Bathsheba's care under very strange circumstances. According to the medical report, the cause of death was severe brain trauma due to a large sewing needle that was inserted at the base of the baby's skull and driven up through his brain. The other disturbing story about Bathsheba had to do with her own son. According to legend, Judson Sherman walked in on his wife Bathsheba as she was sacrificing her son to the devil. This, obviously, greatly angered Mr. Sherman, who left to retrieve a weapon to kill his wife, for she had obviously been taken over by the darkness and couldn't be allowed to continue living. But by the time Mr. Sherman returned, minutes later, Bathsheba had climbed a nearby tree and hanged herself. This would have been sometime in the 1850s. And what makes the story somewhat unbelievable is the fact that Bathsheba Sherman has a tombstone in Harrisville that gives her date of death in 1885, some 30 years later. The Arnold house, however, would remain in the family for a total of 8 generations. Collectively, the Arnolds would encounter far more than their share of tragedy, death, and peculiar circumstances. Children drowning in the nearby creek, psychotic breaks that were attributed to witchcraft or demonic possession, suicide by hanging in the attic on multiple occasions. Until finally, the house passed out of the Arnold bloodline and, although purchased, would remain empty for decades. Why? As soon as any new family would move in, the hauntings would start. But all that paranormal activity was generally attributed to Native American curses, and it wouldn't be until the 1970s that the name Bathsheba Sherman would resurface. Fast forward to 1971 and the arrival of the Perrone family. Roger and Carolyn Perrone and their 5 daughters moved into the 250-year-old farmhouse in January. Roger had been struggling as an out-of-work truck driver, and the family felt very lucky to have been able to buy the house, as it was large enough to accommodate their family, and it also sat on a wonderful piece of land in the New England countryside. But almost immediately, the troubles began. The incidents seemed innocent enough at first. A strange noise from another room, a missing item that was just right there on the counter. Then things escalated to the mildly troublesome, like a small, neat pile of dirt suddenly appearing in the middle of a recently swept floor. Strange footsteps in an otherwise empty house. Then came the downright terrifying and dangerous. Apparitions appearing before them, attacking the family and causing injury, beds shaking violently and rising off the floor. The family was at a total loss as to how to proceed. They soon consulted a well-known spiritual medium who, after interviewing family members and investigating the house, came to the conclusion that they were being haunted by the evil, unsettled spirit of Bathsheba Sherman. The main piece of evidence for this was related to a specific attack on Mrs. Perrone, the lady of the house. Mrs. Perrone had been napping on the couch when she was awoken by a sharp pain in her lower leg. She soon found a puncture wound, a hole, as if she'd been bitten by a one-fanged snake, or maybe stabbed with a large sewing needle. A séance was held to attempt to communicate with Bathsheba and force her to leave the family alone. But all that did was lead to the temporary possession of Mrs. Perrone, allegedly by Bathsheba. It was an absolutely horrifying night for the Perrone family, as the children watched while their mother suffered incredible pain and torment, her body writhing on the floor, a strange, and guttural language screaming from her mouth. But she survived. They all did, actually, and they remained in the house for 7 more years. Mr. Perrone never quite buying into the claim that there were spirits in the house. But the Perrone kids came to view the ghosts as family and were actually sad to leave them behind when the family sold the house. Sad because they knew the spirits were trapped there and they would never see them again. But was Bathsheba really the bad guy? In interviews given years later, the oldest Perrone daughter, Andrea, claims that the spiritual medium jumped to conclusions when she named Bathsheba as the evil witch whose spirit was haunting the house. I mean, can you blame her? With a resume like the one Bathsheba allegedly had in life, it would make sense that she would become an unsettled, evil ghost. Satanist, witch, baby killer, it all adds up. Except for one detail that the medium apparently overlooked. This spirit very often appeared to members of the Perrone family, and one thing that was always consistent was the position of the apparition's head. It was always tilted horribly to one side, with the neck clearly broken at an odd angle. More digging through the ancient records of Harrisville revealed that in 1797, the original Mrs. Arnold, the original inhabitant of the house, had hanged herself in the barn at the age of 93. The Perrone family now believes that it was Mrs. Arnold, and not the innocent Bathsheba Sherman that had so violently haunted them all those years. I'm talking, of course, about the movie The Conjuring, another Ed and Lorraine Warren investigation that was exploited for profit. It was Lorraine who implicated Bathsheba on little or no evidence, and Ed who actually performed the exorcism on the evening of the seance. Ed would maintain that he, in fact, did not perform an exorcism because that rite was the sole territory of a Catholic priest. However, eyewitnesses claim that he totally did. In recent years, including in a book, Andrea Perrone has gone out of her way to clear Bathsheba's name and to put the focus on the late Mrs. Arnold as the probable entity that caused all the trouble. And for the record, the family that currently resides in the farmhouse has reported exactly 0 encounters with anything paranormal and has, in fact, gone to great lengths to discredit and debunk every single claim made by previous occupants of the Arnold house. So what's the verdict? Is Tower Hill Road more haunted than Clinton Road? Maybe. But as far as overall spookiness goes, I think that Clinton Road, with its long history of satanic activity, coupled with the reported ghostly encounters over the years, would eventually win out. Tell you what, the drive from North Jersey to Rhode Island is only a couple of hours. Why not make the trip and do a side-by-side comparison, kind of a paranormal take on the Pepsi Challenge? That's a reference for my Gen X brothers and sisters out there. And as far as Bathsheba and the Arnold house go, the Conjuring movie franchise has been incredibly successful, even if the Warrens have been largely discredited over the past few years. Was there something not of this world occurring in that old farmhouse? Did Bathsheba get a bad rap? To hear the new owner of the house tell it, no to the first and no way of knowing the second. They attribute the whole story to emotional distress, excited young minds playing tricks, and the influence of a charlatan to make them believe that what they were witnessing was the work of angry, vengeful spirits. So, Rhode Island. A friend once called it the small state with the big balls. Given the nature of its founding, the revolutionary history, and man, the endless stories of the paranormal and the supernatural, I'd say that's a pretty accurate description. Thanks for listening to The Devil Within. Please make sure you're following the show so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.